to my immediate right here, our first panelist that I would like to introduce is Rod Pacheco. He is currently a partner at S&R Denton Law Firm downtown. He was formerly a district attorney of Riverside County from 2007 to 2010. And he is also a former state assemblyman, where he was a vice chairman of the Republican caucus and later the caucus or minority leader. Next to him, we have Jessica Blakely, who is an undergraduate student here at USC in the Global Health and International Relations program. Next to Jessica, we have Paul Feldman, who is an assistant foreign editor for the Los Angeles Times. He was a reporter and editor at the LA Times for more than 3 decades, and before that worked at a number of papers in the Midwest and the East Coast. And next to him, we have Shikhar Gupta, who is also a USC undergraduate student and international relations major. And then joining me, as always, as my co-panelist, is Yasmin Sirhan. She's the editorial director of the USC Daily Trojan. So join me in welcoming our panelists. So as many of you may have seen in our promotions for this event, the title of the event is "The Crisis in Ukraine, Is U.S. Diplomacy Enough?" And I think that the title is somewhat timely in that we read in the headlines this morning that Secretary John Kerry will fly to London very soon to meet with his Russian counterpart, the Russian foreign minister, on Friday of this week, just ahead of the planned referendum for this weekend in Crimea to decide whether it will become a part of Russia. So we like to have timely events here at the Enner Institute. We hope this one is timely in the headlines. So I'd like to get started on that and to talk a little bit about the referendum as it's planned. Various United States dignitaries have come out and said that they don't think that it's a good idea. Some have said that it's not. Some have said that it is. President Obama has said that we are prepared to not recognize the results of this referendum. He said it would be a violation of international law. If we could talk a little bit about the legality of this referendum. Is it something that even if it moves forward and happens as we anticipate that it will, what does that mean in terms of consequences? What really will be a result of that?
And she's looking at me. I'm the lawyer of the group. Let me talk about 2 levels of that question. Can you hear me all right in the back? Okay. Is that better?
There you go.
There's 2 levels to that question. One is kind of the technical legal level, which is, do they have a constitution that affords the citizens the right to separate on a regional basis from the larger nation of Ukraine? My guess of that, as to the answer to that question, is they don't. The Crimean region used to have a constitution back in 1992. That's gone. It was disbanded, abolished, if you will. In fact, that's one of the questions on the referendum that will be offered on Sunday. I also think that if there was such a legal basis for the move, then certainly Russia, Putin et al. Would have offered that basis to justify the actions that they've taken. The fact that they haven't tells me that they don't have one, that they're kind of just going to do it. Remember, the referendum was set originally in May, and they moved that up a few months so that they could take further actions. The second part and second level of that is, and in politics there's always 2 levels, the surface and the current. The current of this is, does Russia really care if they have a legal basis or not? That region, like most of Europe, has been expanding and contracting, not in literal inches or feet or miles, but in terms of boundaries and borders for hundreds and hundreds of years. That particular region was at some point ruled by the Polish government, country of Poland, ruled by the Mongols under Genghis Khan, was ruled by various Russian czars, and constantly shifting borders and sands. Peter the Great from Russia expanded their borders down to that region to get a warm water port, et cetera, et cetera. So they've never really relied on legal bases for those new borders. It's really just kind of a naked power grab. Not the first time.
Issue more about real politics, I think, than it is about legal bases, because there's no one that's going to be enforcing the legal bases anyway. Russia has veto power at the UN, and basically they've done what they want to do so far, and there's very little way for the West to stop them. And so it does appear right now that whatever happens, whoever puts up a fuss about the legal basis for it probably is not going to get very far except to win moral points.
I guess I'll throw a little bit in there. I'm definitely not a lawyer. I'm too young for that. But from what I know about Russia, Russia is very bad at following international law historically to begin with. A lot of that is seen throughout the 50s and 60s with the various revolutions that took place in the Czech Republic, well, what is now the Czech Republic, and Hungary. And Russia stamped down a lot of those revolutions as it saw fit, and I feel like paying attention to what the international law would say would not be one of Putin's priorities here either.
Well, maybe just kind of to give some background for those in the audience who aren't quite as familiar as what's been going on the past few weeks, maybe we could talk a little bit about kind of the ethnic, economic, and social makeup of Crimea and like their alliance with Russia. Shikhar, maybe you want to start with that.
Yeah, so the breakdown of Crimea, as it was mentioned earlier, it's historically been part of like various different empires, nations, kingdoms, and whatnot. And it was part of the Soviet Union, part of like the Russian, like Soviet Socialist Republic, whatever like the breakdown term was, until the 50s when Khrushchev, he took off Crimea from Russia and gave it to Ukraine as kind of a gesture of goodwill. And since then, it's been part of Ukraine. And in the 90s, with the breakup of the Soviet Union, Crimea was given kind of an autonomous status within Ukraine. So that's kind of like more like the political history of what Crimea has been for the past, like, generally 50 years. And then beyond that, the ethnic makeup, it's significantly Russian, but there's also a decent-sized Tatar population in Crimea as well, who have been there, who are ethnically Turks and have been there way longer than the Russians have. And they are not too fond of the Russian influence or the Russian rule there.
Yes, also going off that, I believe the exact percentage of Crimea is 60% Russian Ukrainian minorities, and a little bit about why they feel more strongly tied to Russia. As with a lot of other places in Eastern Europe that were prior conquered by the Soviet Union, people in Ukraine, for the most part, take a lot of pride in not speaking Russian. And so for a minority on the island of Crimea to say, I am proud to speak Russian, that says a lot for their ideological ties as well.
Just one thing I would add, there's another really important piece, and I think it hasn't been discussed too much in the media, a little bit here, a little bit there, but I think it matters a lot to someone like Putin, and that is this is a very, very, very important strategic base for the Soviet Union, for Russia. They have a major naval facility there. It is a warm water port. They can reach any part of the Middle East. They can reach throughout the Mediterranean. That was the basis for them invading in the first place by Peter the Great. So they're not about to let that port go. As you noticed early on, they maintained that particular naval installation and then surrounded the other very small ones that were manned by Ukrainian military, of which I think there's only about 6,000 combat-ready troops in Ukraine. So they're not really willing to put up a fight.
The capacity to put up a fight, there's 200,000 versus 6,000, unless it's the U.S. hockey team, 1980 or something. I think they're going to beat the Russians in this case.
So with that in mind, and looking forward to this weekend when the referendum's set to be voted on, what would the consequences be of this referendum passing?
Yeah, I think it's going to pass. I think they're going to have a great vote. And I was joking earlier, I think they've already probably counted the ballots. It's already done. The only the only city that the airlines are allowed to fly to and from now in Crimea are to Moscow, so they probably brought the bags with them or bringing them. The consequences, we have really two choices. And when I say we, I say collectively the world, not just the United States. We can talk to them or we can fight with them. We saw in Syria, we saw in Libya, we saw in a lot of other places in the world, there was a lot of hectoring about the United States using military force from various parts of our constituencies about getting in there doing something militarily. You don't hear any of that now. I mean, nobody is saying, let's get in there and fight with Russia. I mean, I haven't seen it anywhere. Nobody's talking about it for very, very good reason. They are a major, major force in the world to this day, in spite of where they were. So it looks like we're going to talk about it. We're going to issue sanctions, which are going to be pretty effective given what's already happened with the ruble. As soon as this conflagration started, this invasion started, the ruble immediately dropped significantly. So I think they're going to suffer pretty good. And Russia needs the West for its economy.
At the same time, while there may be few voices saying that Russia should be fought over this, there seem to be a lot of voices, particularly in the Republican Party in the U.S., that are blaming, as they do it seems with almost everything, Obama for being weak, for being a wimp. And so, I'm curious, as a Republican, I mean, how do you see this thing, or as they say on Fox News, what do you make of this? I mean, basically, I'm just not quite sure how it all plays out and what the real interests are in politics in the U.S. when you have half of the politicians in the U.S. attacking their own president as being a wimp over something that they know they wouldn't fight over either.
Well, political calculation, particularly in Washington or in Sacramento, is the province of man, not of one party or the other. So Democrats have done it to Bush and other Republican presidents and vice versa. It's just, it's about trying to achieve something on a political level. They have midterm elections coming up. The Republicans look pretty good. Just won a big special in Florida that they were supposed to lose. And so, that's kind of where I think some of those voices are coming from, and I'm fairly convinced of that. But the larger question is whether, at least in my opinion, he's done a pretty good job. I think the president's done a very good job in foreign policy. I got a lot of issues with his domestic policies, but foreign policy, I think he's been an excellent president. And I would add, not to dig the hole a little further for me as a Republican, but the one toughest voice, at least initially, which has kind of receded now, was from Hillary Clinton when she compared the actions of Putin to Adolf Hitler. They are identical. When he took over the Sudetenland, when he divided Czechoslovakia with the help of European powers, and not just Hitler. I mean, you could look thousands of years through history. There's always been that excuse. Alexander the Great invaded Persia because of the maltreatment of Greeks living in Asia Minor. I mean, it was an excuse. So it's a common one.
On that note of politics, you were mentioning the political angles. If the vote goes ahead and if it is passed, are there still chances for a political solution that the U.S. can have a voice in that are meaningful? Are sanctions still going to be at play? Will anyone over there find that to be meaningful in any way that changes the future? Or are there other diplomatic efforts that the U.S. can suggest? Shikhar?
Regarding sanctions, the amount the Russians have invested in the United States is not significant enough to cause dramatic damage to their economy or significantly bring them down. It would require both a effort from the United States as well as the EU, because the Russians have far more invested within the European Union, and should the European Union actually crack down upon Russia and issue significant sanctions, that could actually significantly affect Russia. But that would involve the EU having to sacrifice a lot of the investments in their nations, and that would also significantly cripple them as well. So that's the dilemma in getting the EU to also tag along if the United States are to formally issue sanctions.
Yes, I see the issue not being one that should be used from a military force standpoint. I personally feel as though this issue, yes, it includes the U.S., but it is not directly related to U.S. affairs. I feel it is more directly related to the European Union affairs, since Ukraine pro-Western forces would like to eventually one day join the EU. But the problem with that is, from my understanding, I'm not an EU expert, from my understanding, the EU doesn't necessarily have a standing military, so they would have to have individual countries within the EU recruit forces to take part in what would be a conflict, war, what have you. I don't see that going well on their behalf. I don't see individual countries volunteering their troops for this. So even though an economic sanctions might not work, I feel as though there must be some diplomatic solution. I personally do not know what that would look like at this point, though.
Well, as we said, Secretary Kerry is en route to London to discuss this further, but he was quoted saying, "It is diplomacy and respect for sovereignty, not unilateral force, that can best solve disputes like this in the 21st century." So with that in mind, how likely do you think a diplomatic agreement might be reached, even if the referendum were to pass?
Yeah, I don't think there's going to be an agreement. I think it's going to go exactly as Putin's actions before in Georgia, when he cut out a piece of Georgia, South Ossetia, and created his own state, basically, with tanks, exactly like he's doing now. What has been done to stop that action? Nothing, basically. So I think we're in the same exact situation. I think we'll talk about it. Politicians, just from spending so much time around them, I'll give you a little bit of insight. I'm sure you've seen it yourself. Politicians, when their constituencies want them to do something but don't necessarily know what they should do, politicians have a choice, and the choice is to actually do something, fill in the pothole, so to speak, invade, defend, whatever, raise minimum wage, lower minimum wage, whatever it is they're asked to do, or they can appear to be doing something. And I think that's a dilemma we have here as a nation. Are we going to actually do something, impose sanctions, create some pain in Russia, because of the actions of their government, or are we going to appear to be opposing sanctions? And I think for politicians, appearance typically is more important. If they can convince us that they're actually doing something without the cost of doing it, then that's probably not a bad solution for them. And I don't blame the president or anybody else for that matter. It's just the way politicians are.
It's basically what's going to happen is whatever Putin decides is going to happen. And it is interesting, though, one little wrinkle is that in the last day, I think the pro-Russian Crimean parliament decided that the vote would be on an independent state, not a part of Russia. And of course, that's another level of fig leaves, I guess, in a way. And in terms of diplomacy, I suppose there's some way that the diplomatic effort could go on with Crimea, sort of, dealing with Crimea as opposed to Russia specifically, and whoever no one knows what would happen then either, and what the next steps would be. But there's sort of like each day there's new developments that seem to give some slight more options in terms of diplomatic solutions, or at least diplomatic talk.
We're about to the midpoint of the hour, and that's the time in which we ask all of you to ask questions of our panelists. And so if you could just start beginning to think about any questions you may have for our panelists. We'll get to that in a few moments. I just have one follow-up question about the political angle, and it's really more about the optics of the situation. Rod, you mentioned that we are in a midterm election year. The Republicans are looking to make great strides. We had a special election that was maybe a surprise to some. And, of course, there's been a discussion between the Obama administration and the Congress about what level of support we would provide to this part of the world. And the House voted to provide a loan guarantee. But Senator Robert Menendez, a Democrat from New Jersey, wants to combine it with measures to overhaul the International Monetary Fund that the House may not support. So given that we are in a midterm election year, and I also wanted to tie it to the optics of the timing of this happening after the conclusion of the Olympics, the recent Olympics in Sochi. To what extent does timing matter to politicians and to just the global news network?
You know, timing is everything in politics. In June of this year, the 8 largest countries in the world, G8, will meet in Sochi. The president has indicated he might not attend. I'll be interested to see that, whether he doesn't attend or not, whether he attends or not. But the timing is really, really important. And the midterm elections are going to go very well for the Republican Party this time. They've gone poorly in the past, but it's cyclical. So I don't think the Ukraine is going to have an impact, since it is not a bread and butter issue for voters, probably in any district. It's interesting and people care about it, but I don't know that they're going to cast a vote on what a representative does, like Senator Menendez.
Yeah, I have to agree with that. Foreign policy is typically not an issue that changes a person's vote unless it comes to military force, which then directly affects them. So with something like Ukraine, it's not going to change their vote whether they're voting Republican or Democrat for their representative, and in that sense, it's not going to significantly alter the face of, you know, the midterm elections in the coming probably like 6-7 months.
All right. Well, sorry. Did you?
I was just going to say, my take would be, I would caution a lot of U.S. policymakers right now on the comments that they are making publicly. I thought that Hillary Clinton's statement was very, very bold. Sure, it had historical backing, but making comparisons to Hitler is one of those things that is always too soon. Oh.
All right. Well, at this point in time, we'd like to invite the audience to ask questions to our panelists. We just ask that when you're addressing the panel, please be specific as to who you're addressing the question to. Also, please include your name, and if you're a student, your major and year. And as always with these panels, if you're addressing a panelist with whom you may disagree, try not to be disagreeable. But with that in mind, does anyone have the first question? Yeah, Nathaniel, I guess first.
Political science, economics major. When Obama came out and called this a violation of national sovereignty, and when the majority of U.S. politicians sort of started criticizing Russia's actions, I was a little shocked. Do any of you think that it's hypocritical for the international community in light of what's happened in the last decade in geopolitics, Iraq, Afghanistan, most recently what we did in Libya with NATO, to criticize anything that Russia does, especially given that the majority, or I guess, 60% of the people in Crimea identify more with Russia than they do with Ukraine? I mean, it seems like, if anything, this is the most benign intervention that's happened in the last 10 years, just given the things that the United States and NATO have done.
I'll take that. Let me suggest to you that I watch people. I'm a trial lawyer by trade. That's what I do. And so people are very important to me. And so watching Putin tells me a lot about what he thinks. And so I would say that he disagrees with you. And the reason why I would tell you that is because he has created a rather elaborate fantasy about why they're there, or whether they are even there. These are self-defense forces. They're driving our trucks. They've got our license plates on those trucks. They're using all our Russian weapons. Their uniforms look just like ours without the patches, but it's really not us. That tells me that he knows that what he's doing is wrong and rather significant. He's trying to hide it. People that try to hide things recognize the significance of the things they're trying to hide. So I and it's real clear. It's odd to me, I'll just make this point, but I didn't think about it. It's odd to me to see articles, media articles, that talk about these defense forces as if what Putin's saying is true. Because I think 99% of the planet who knows anything about this issue knows that it's actually the Russian military in there, and we should just say it. And some of the articles do, but very few of them do. And the reason why I say it's odd, thinking of a different example, if President Obama came out tomorrow and said, the woman I've been married to is actually from the planet Venus, and she's not really from this planet, I doubt that she would then be described as someone from the planet Venus every time she's mentioned. It's not credible, it's not believable, it's kind of goofy. For him to say that this is not our military, it's just a flat out lie. It ought to be presented as such. And that's why I think it's very significant what he's done. Tanks and trucks and guns, that's big stuff. That can create war.
I can't vouch for every media outlet, and I wouldn't want to, but I know in our case, we will let Putin say what he has to say. I mean, he could say they're not his forces, and we let him say that. At the same time, we also say they're in Russian trucks with Russian license plates, that they wear the same kind of uniforms as the Russians. I mean, even if we don't flat out say it, we say what's going on. I mean, to me, they look a little like the guys in Toy Story, the Green Army. That's another thing.
Next question? Yes, there in the second row.
Hi, my name is Luke Phillips. I'm an international relations major, and I'd like to direct my question primarily to the two panelists who will be crafting U.S. foreign policy in a couple decades from now. So, I think a lot of the opposition to the action in Crimea has been based on the notion that there is a functioning liberal international order where all states have their sovereignty and human rights ought to be protected, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. At what point do we, as prudent foreign policy thinkers, have to acknowledge that that's just kind of the sheen over the top, and underneath that there's this brutal, realpolitik world where nation states do as they will to preserve their interests? And at what point does that necessitate a change in strategic thinking? We don't have a real interest in Crimea other than not letting Putin do what he wants to do willy-nilly. But at the same time, can we look with some compassion to him, like what if something similar were happening in Mexico? And 100 years ago, when something similar was happening in Mexico, we did the same thing, we intervened. So I just want to ask our future foreign policy strategists up here, are we looking at this the wrong way? And if we are, what time is it, when is it time for us to start thinking of new ways to think about grand strategy in the world?
The way I see it is that while it is preferable to look at it from like a geopolitical or more like broad, kind of like all-inclusive perspective, the foreign policy makers, their decisions are colored by domestic politics as well as foreign politics. So while we may not be thinking about it in like the way it should be done, they're thinking about it in the way that's most convenient for them in terms of, well, preserving political capital and what they're going to use their fight for. As you know, like last year, the whole Syria thing, Obama used a little too much political capital there, and there's only so much he could actually afford to use here. He's got to stay, there's only so much he could do because he had a pretty massive agenda he outlined in January in the State of the Union that he wanted to do. And there's only so much he could actually continue to do that while also trying to address Ukraine. So that's definitely taking a sort of backseat for him. And in that line, like, I just don't see any thinker, any leader, whether they be Democrat, Republican, anyway, shifting their way of thinking about foreign policy, or even sympathizing with Putin in a way that might be, more logical, but in a way that, disagrees with like domestic politics and general political opinion.
Never mind. Okay, so I agree with you that on a deeper level, states do still tend to act in their own interest, and that does seem to be the case here in Putin's perspective. He does not seem to be looking at what would be the international consequences, or I'm sure he knows the international consequences, but he just doesn't care. However, I do not believe that this should be a U.S. issue where the U.S. decides on its own terms to have any kind of intervention, because the pro-democracy and pro-Western forces in Ukraine, their goal is with the EU, and while U.S. and EU goals typically are relatively similar, they're not hand in hand. So I believe that the U.S. should be working with our EU comrades to decide what the best course of action should be. At this time, Ms. Catherine Ashton of the European Commission, she has issued a statement saying we want to help in whatever way possible, but she has not outlined yet what she believes that should look like or how she should go about it. If she and the rest of the EU leaders decide later on that they need to call on NATO for help, then the U.S. should help. Until then, I think this needs to be more of us working through them on their lines rather than our own stance.
Okay, next question, yes.
Hello, my name is Irena Zagaruka, and I am a student of law school here at USC, and I'm Ukrainian. And I know many facts on the ground, and I would be happy to share if you have any questions. I just would like to make focus here in this discussion. We are talking about human rights, we are talking about sovereignty, and we are talking about global security. It's, in the case of Crimea, it's not regional security, it's a global security. Because we are talking about Black Sea. And believe me or not, but when we talk about rights of Russian right of Russian Ukrainians in Crimea, it's not the dominant element here in this conflict, because if somebody claims that these rights were not protected, he would have to learn the situation before the conflict, and you would see Russian schools, Russian communication, so there were not human rights issues that time. Now it is. Human rights issue is very, very important, and of all population as a whole, and because it's refugee issues, it's a question of water and food supply and everything. But I want to make a focus on this global security issue, because we are talking about Black Sea, and it's interesting how you contemplate the role of the USA in this conflict, and I know that nobody wants a war, and Ukrainians don't want a war, and American people don't want to get involved into the war.
I'm sorry, do you have a direct question in regards to human rights for the panelists?
Okay, I will have a question, but I would like just to make a focus on the Black Sea, because American and the US and Russia compete just number 1 and 2 or 2 and 1 in all armed forces. The only weakness of Russia is the sea forces. Russia does not have entrance to the open water, and that's the biggest weakness of Russia. And when we are talking about Black Sea, my question is whether, well, the question will be very obvious, but what is the role of the USA when we are talking about participation of NATO in the conflict of Crimea?
So
I just want to make a shift to this part.
Sure. So for those who didn't hear the question, what is the role of the U.S. in this conflict in regards to NATO?
You mean specifically U.S. forces in NATO, correct? Okay. Well, historically speaking, in the past 20 years, the U.S. has typically taken the largest role in NATO. We have the largest military force percentage-wise, especially in the Kosovo Civil War back in 1999-2000. It was a U.S. general that was pretty much in charge of the entire operation. I would not be surprised if the EU and the U.S. decided, okay, we need to bring NATO forces on board here. I would not be surprised if the U.S. is heavily pressured to supply the large amount of force. Do I think that that would be successful and U.S. policymakers that are on board with that will be able to convince the rest of the country? I don't know, but if that is the case, if NATO is needed, I would not be surprised if the U.S. is pulled in heavily.
I don't see that happening. Ukraine is not a member of NATO, obviously. That's the problem, and that's actually what may have precipitated Putin's actions, because they were trying to become a member, but the president, who's now in Russia, was preventing that and had reversed course in approaching the West and gone back to the East at Putin's request and inference. So I don't see that. Any time a war starts, it is hard to contain it. And between NATO, which is us, and Russia, where does that end? This president, no American president would enter that war. No American president would commit our troops to that fight on this basis. I couldn't imagine it happening. With the potential for nuclear exchange, it'd be amazing. I'm against it.
Next question. Yes, sir.
Dan Lewin, senior poli-sci business. I guess my question is, do you see this as a victory, or at least if it plays out like it seems like it's going to play out and Russia is able to annex the region, do you see this as a victory for Putin in Russia? But it seems like it's kind of the way it's being portrayed in the media, and to me it seems like Crimea is very much a consolation prize to the original issue, which was whether Ukraine was going to go to the EU or to join Russia. And when they looked like they were going to the EU, Putin, we all know what happened, Putin pressured Yanukovych went with Russia, Yanukovych was thrown out. Now Ukraine has a pro-Western government, is likely going to go to the EU, and Russia's going to get this region and basically maintain the status quo of their warm water naval bases. So to me, it doesn't feel like, even if Russia is able to annex the territory, a victory for Russia. And I just wonder, Rod, and any of you guys, how you feel about that, because it seems like that's very much the pervasive notion in the media, and it's one that I really can't wrap my head around. It's not one that seems to be based in logic.
The question is this, if it goes forward and if they are annexed, is that truly a victory for Russia?
Absolutely. Without question. And we have American minds, with the exception of a person from Ukraine. We see the world differently than I believe folks in Europe do. And they have a very different history than us. And the history of Russia has been one of invasion, not only their own, but many countries have invaded them. Napoleon took 500,000 French troops into Russia, burned down their cities, ended up losing that war, came home with 10,000 to 500,000. They have always, Hitler, Genghis Khan, you name it, they have always had a historical interest in having buffers between their major cities and those who would cause them. Ukraine, right or wrong, I place no value judgment on it, is a buffer. Crimea has an individual additional bonus because of the port, but the country of Ukraine is a buffer, and they've used it as such. Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, all buffers. There's other benefits too, but their primary purpose has always been the buffer.
Jikar?
I agree with that point, actually. A lot of the Central Asian countries, former Soviet republics, is the reason why Russia has been trying to reach out to them and create a sort of, I forgot the term for it, but there was an organization that basically is promoted on like cooperation of all these former Soviet states. It's because Putin wants to bring them towards his own bloc, create a sort of buffer, a kind of region where he doesn't have to worry about intervention from like other countries, possible invasions, influence, and whatnot. which is why whenever influence from other nations come into his kind of like sphere of influence, i.e. Ukraine trying to move over into the EU, it becomes more of a problem for him and why he becomes more involved.
If I could jump back in, sorry, that's not the protocol. I understand the concept of the buffer state. Ukraine and Crimea are both buffer regions. It seems to me like if this plays out like it's going to play out, Russia will have Crimea, but it will lose the much bigger and much more important buffer region of Ukraine, which will then go to the EU. There's a pro-Western government. Go for it, Rob.
But how do you know that? How do you know what's going to happen next? I mean,
right.
Once this happens, there's other areas of eastern Ukraine that are also very ethnically Russian. I mean, history will still have to play out. I mean, the story's in flux, so it's really, I think, unclear. And I could agree with Rod that this is a victory, but it's just one of several things or many things that may and will happen in the near future.
It's schoolyard stuff. I mean, I hate that it's evasive, but go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, going off on that as well, if you look at especially the history of Ukraine in the past, 15 years, the politics just go back and forth with the Orange Revolution and the turnovers of one president to another president to prime minister. And the EU process for accession takes a long time. And there could be a lot of factors that go on in that time period that would take place. Because to join the EU, you have to go a very serious and very deep reform process that there could be a lot of people in Ukraine that are more pro-Russian that have a lot of issue with. And so I think it'd be too soon to say that they would for sure go straight to the EU.
I don't think it pushes them to the West. I think it creates fear, and that's one of Putin's aims, to create fear in the Ukrainian government and people that if they approach the West, as they've been doing recently, that's a mistake, and there's a consequence. And putting 200,000 troops on their eastern border when they only have 6,000 is a pretty good threat. I mean, it's schoolyard stuff. It's the bully telling you, you're not sitting on that seat. If you do, I'm going to pound you. Well, you don't go say, well, this other guy's going to help me, and then you ask for help, and they don't give you any help. You're not going to sit on that seat. I mean, you're just not going to go there. And that's just literally what's happening. It's just a kind of a base human element to it. So they win.
All right. Do you have any other questions? Yes.
So I guess I'm just, my name is Kyle. I guess I'm just a little bit confused about Crimea in a way that weren't they a little bit removed from like the whole uprising in Kiev then? And since you said that there's 60% Russians, right? Wouldn't they just lie closer to the police of Russia then? Wouldn't they? Do they want to be part of Russia? I mean, if it gets voted in the referendum that they would be part of the annex, why is it posed problem to Ukraine? Like if they stay part of Ukraine, would that pose any kind of conflict internally in their government?
You mean in the Crimea government itself?
No.
In the Ukrainian government overall?
Yeah.
Well, that's actually a really interesting question. I'm not quite sure how to answer it. I mean, I think it definitely poses a conflict. I'm actually not sure how removed they were from the crisis in Kiev. I'm sure they were quite interested to see how it would go, especially on their behalf, being pro-Russian and more economically, I don't want to say devoted to Russian affairs. So they could have been more welcoming to the Russian forces coming in, but I'm really not sure how that would go about.
Any follow-up now? Okay. I think we have time for one more very quick question. If anyone has a quick one. Okay, yes.
Hello, my name is Bruce Mediato. I'm Language student from Kazakhstan. So I have a question for Mr. Checo. Why is there so much concern about economical union, like customs unions between three countries that you mentioned, from United States government? Why is there so much concern about it?
I'm not tracking. I'm sorry. A concern about what?
About customs union from other republics with Russia.
Oh, you mean linkage between Russia and those other republics?
No, they have union.
Yes.
Customs union. Why is there so much concern about it?
Well, concern there is about it, so I won't defend it because I'm not sure the depth of it. But it's very basic. Russia has traditionally been our enemy. I mean, we worked with them in World War II, but they're traditionally been our enemy. You're very young. I lived through the Cold War, and they were portrayed as we had a president of the United States called them the evil empire, right? So that's how they are perceived by folks in my generation. It's maybe a little bit different recently, but so there's always concern about what they do. Any power they get is a threat to us potentially. Any actions they take that we can't stop is a threat to us potentially. Their ascendancy is our descent, and so I think it's just that basic. They're not our buddy.
I give your question a little bit more thought, and I think I have a more conclusive answer. So it is 60% of Russian minorities, but that leaves the other 40% to deal with, and that's a pretty split majority overall. And regarding the Tatars, they being ethnically Turk, they actually left during the 70s and 80s while the Soviet Union was still in power and came back from 1991 on because they no longer felt the fear that the Russians were their overlords. And so it could be really interesting to see if the referendum passes, will they all migrate back to Turkey? There's a big diaspora movement. That could happen.
Well, I have a few announcements about the Unruh Institute, but before I get to those, please join me in thanking our tremendous panel, Rod Pacheco, Paul Redmond, and Jessica Backley, and of course my wonderful co-moderator from the USA Daily Trojan, Yasmin Sirhan. Thank you very much to she and her colleagues at the Daily Trojan.